Faith Harper clutched her trembling hand over her stomach, the bitter autumn wind carrying her father's final words across the desolate yard. "No daughter of mine bears a child in sin. You're dead to us now." It was 1878 in Las Lunas, New Mexico, and at 19 years old, Faith had just become a ghost to her own flesh and blood. The door slammed behind her with such force that dust scattered from the porch beams. Faith stood frozen, her small carpet bag containing the only possessions her mother had managed to slip to her while her father raged. The weight of her 3-month pregnancy pressed against her corset, hidden but impossible to ignore, just like the absence of the child's father, a charming railroad man who had moved on with the tracks, unaware of what he'd left behind. "Just go," her mother had whispered, pressing a small pouch of coins into Faith's palm. "Find someplace safe. When your father's temper cools," but they both knew Reverend Harper's temper never cooled when it came to matters of morality. The Harper name stood for something in Las Lunas, and a pregnant, unwed daughter would not be tolerated. Faith wiped away a tear and squared her shoulders. Night was falling, and she had nowhere to go. The Harper family parsonage sat on the outskirts of town, and Faith began the long walk toward Las Lunas proper, unsure what awaited her there, but knowing she couldn't stay within sight of her childhood home. The main street was quieting as she arrived, shopkeepers closing up for the night. Faith kept her head down, painfully aware that news would spread quickly in a town this size. She paused outside the Sagebrush Hotel, counting the coins in her pouch. She might afford 2 nights, maybe 3, but then what, Miss Harper? A voice called from across the street. Faith stiffened, turning slowly to see Mrs. Wilkins, the seamstress, watching her with concern from her shop doorway. "I heard the shouting all the way from the church," Mrs. Wilkins said softly, crossing to her. "Your father's voice carries when he's in a state." Faith felt her cheeks burn with shame. "I need a place to stay," she admitted. Mrs. Wilkins sighed, glancing up and down the street. "I'd offer my spare room, but your father, he controls much of what happens in this town. My business wouldn't survive his wrath." She pressed her lips together. "I'm sorry, child," Faith nodded, understanding the woman's position even as desperation clawed at her throat. "Do you know of anywhere I might go?" "The Colton Ranch," Mrs. Wilkins said after a moment's thought. "It's about 5 miles west of town. Caleb Simmons runs it now, since old man Colton passed. He's a good sort, keeps to himself mostly, but fair. He might have worked for you, at least until—" Her eyes dropped briefly to Faith's middle before meeting her gaze again. "He doesn't attend your father's church. Might be your best chance." Faith clutched her bag tighter. 5 miles west, you said. Follow the main road until you see the split oak, then take the dirt path north. Can't miss the ranch house. It's the only 2-story building for miles around." Mrs. Wilkins hesitated, then reached into her pocket and pressed something into Faith's hand. "Take my handkerchief. Night's getting cold." With that small kindness warming her more than the thin square of fabric ever could, Faith resumed her journey. The light was fading fast, and each step took her further from the only home she'd ever known. Her practical boots, the only concession to comfort her father had allowed his daughters, were sturdy but not made for such a long journey. By the time she spotted the split oak Mrs. Wilkins had mentioned, blisters had formed on both heels, and her legs trembled with exhaustion. The dirt path stretching northward seemed endless in the gathering darkness. Faith paused, catching her breath and fighting a wave of nausea, whether from the pregnancy or fear. She couldn't tell. The distant howl of a coyote sent a shiver down her spine. "Just a bit further," she whispered to herself, to the child, to whoever might be listening. The moon had risen by the time the Colton Ranch came into view, a solid shadow against the star-filled sky. A lantern burned in a downstairs window, a beacon that nearly brought Faith to tears. She limped the final distance to the front porch, each step agony on her raw feet. She raised her hand to knock, then hesitated. What would she say? How could she possibly explain? But the alternative, turning back, wasn't an option. She rapped her knuckles against the solid wood door. Silence followed, then the sound of boots on floorboards. The door swung open, revealing a tall figure holding a lantern. "Can I help you, madam?" The voice was deep, tinged with curiosity rather than suspicion. Faith looked up into the face of a man, perhaps 5 or 6 years her senior. His features were handsome in the lantern light's strong jaw covered with several days' worth of stubble, straight nose, eyes that seemed to take in her disheveled appearance without judgment. "Are you Mr. Simmons?" Faith asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I am. Caleb Simmons." He lifted the lantern higher, illuminating more of her face. "You look half frozen, miss." "Harper, Faith Harper." She saw no recognition in his eyes at the surname and felt a small measure of relief. "Mrs. Wilkins in town said you might. That is, I need." The words tangled in her throat as exhaustion and desperation overwhelmed her. Understanding dawned in Caleb's expression as he took in her trembling form and the small bag clutched in white-knuckled fingers. "You need a place to stay," he said simply, and stepped back from the doorway. "My door is always open wide to those who need shelter, Miss Harper. Come in before you catch your death out there." Faith hesitated only a moment before crossing the threshold, the warmth of the house enveloping her like an embrace. "Thank you," she managed, before her legs gave way beneath her. Caleb moved with surprising speed, catching her before she hit the floor. The last thing Faith remembered was the gentle strength of his arms as he lifted her, and a gruff voice saying, "Easy now. You're safe here." When Faith awoke, golden morning light was streaming through unfamiliar curtains. For a moment, confusion reigned as she took in the simple but comfortable bedroom, a far cry from her Spartanly furnished room at the parsonage. Then memory crashed back. Her father's rage, the long walk, the kind cowboy who'd opened his door. She sat up slowly, noting someone had removed her boots and outer garments but left her under things in place. A clean dress, plain but well-made, was draped over a chair by the bed, alongside a basin of water and a small towel. Faith washed her face and hands, grateful for the small dignity. The dress was a bit loose, especially around the shoulders, but it would serve. Her own clothes, she noticed, had been brushed clean and folded neatly on a trunk at the foot of the bed. A soft knock at the door startled her. "Miss Harper, are you awake?" Caleb's voice came through the wood. "Yes, I am," she called back, smoothing down the borrowed dress. "There's breakfast when you're ready. No rush." Faith listened to his retreating footsteps, then glanced at her reflection in a small mirror hanging on the wall. Her honey-blonde hair was a tangled mess, her blue eyes shadowed with exhaustion despite her sleep. She did her best to tidy herself, using her fingers to comb through the tangles before re-braiding her hair. When she finally ventured out, following the smell of coffee and bacon, she found Caleb in a large kitchen, his broad shoulders bent over the stove. He turned at her entrance, offering a small smile. "Thought you might sleep the day away," he said, but there was no reproach in his tone. "Hungry?" Faith nodded, suddenly aware of the hollow feeling in her stomach. "Starving, actually. Sit." He gestured to a sturdy wooden table. "Coffee, please." He poured her a cup, then returned to the stove to dish up a plate of eggs, bacon, and biscuits that made Faith's mouth water. He set it before her with a nod. "Eat while it's hot. We can talk after." Faith didn't need to be told twice. She ate with as much decorum as her hunger allowed, watching surreptitiously as Caleb moved around the kitchen with the ease of a man accustomed to caring for himself. He wasn't what she'd expected from a rancher. There was a quietness to him, a thoughtfulness in the way he moved and spoke. "The dress fits well enough," he asked, taking a seat across from her with his own plate. Faith nodded. "Thank you, is it?" "My sister's," he supplied. "She lives in Santa Fe now with her husband, but leaves some things here for when she visits." Faith took a sip of coffee, gathering courage. "Mr. Simmons, I should explain why I showed up on your doorstep last night. No need to rush into explanations, Miss Harper." His eyes, she noticed now, were a warm hazel that crinkled slightly at the corners. "You needed shelter, and that's reason enough for me." "That's very kind, but—" Faith set down her cup. "I won't misrepresent myself. I'm in a difficult situation, and it's only fair you know what you're getting involved with by helping me." Caleb leaned back in his chair, regarding her steadily. "All right, then." Faith took a deep breath. "My father is Reverend Harper of the First Baptist Church in Las Lunas. Yesterday he discovered I'm with child." The words felt strange on her tongue, spoken aloud for the first time. The father was a railroad worker passing through. He made promises he didn't keep, and now he's gone. When my condition became known, my father banished me from his home and his life. She waited for judgment to cross Caleb's face, disgust, perhaps, or the righteous disapproval she'd grown up with. Instead, he merely nodded. "That explains why you walked all this way alone." His brow furrowed. "How far along are you?" 3 months, I believe." Caleb took a thoughtful sip of coffee. "And what were you planning to do next?" The simple question caught Faith off guard. In truth, she hadn't thought beyond finding immediate shelter. I don't know," she admitted. "I have a little money, but not enough to start over somewhere. I need work at least until the baby comes." "What can you do?" The question wasn't dismissive, but practical. Faith considered. "I can cook and keep house. I'm good with numbers. I kept the church accounts for my father. I can sew, though not as well as Mrs. Wilkins." Caleb nodded slowly. "As it happens, I could use help around here. My housekeeper, Mrs. Flores, left 2 months ago when her daughter in Albuquerque had twins. Place has been a bit of a mess since." Hope flickered in Faith's chest. "You'd hire me, despite my situation." "Your situation is your business, Miss Harper. What matters to me is whether you can cook better than I can, which, judging by your polite silence about these eggs, isn't saying much." A hint of humor warmed his voice. Faith couldn't help the small smile that tugged at her lips. "The eggs are fine, Mr. Simmons." "Caleb," he corrected. "If you're going to be living here, we might as well use first names." "Faith, then," she offered in return. "So here's what I propose, Faith," Caleb said, folding his arms on the table. "You stay here, keep house, and cook. In return, you get room, board, and wages. When your time comes, we'll figure out the next step. No need to decide everything today." It seemed too simple, too generous. Faith searched his face for hidden motives but found only straightforward honesty. "Why would you do this for a stranger?" she asked finally. Caleb's expression grew distant for a moment. "I know what it's like to be judged for circumstances beyond your control. Besides, my mother would haunt me if I turned away a woman in need." He stood, collecting their empty plates. "The job's yours if you want it." Faith realized she'd been holding her breath. "I accept, thank you." Caleb nodded, seeming pleased. "Good, I'll show you around the place after breakfast. It's just me here most days. I have 2 ranch hands, brothers named Garcia, but they have their own cabin near the corral. You'll meet them at dinner, likely." As he spoke, giving her a brief overview of the ranch and its routines, Faith felt something she hadn't expected to find again so soon: hope. It was fragile, tentative, but it was there, warming her from within like the morning sun now streaming through the kitchen windows. The first weeks at the Colton ranch passed in a blur of activity as Faith settled into her new role. The work was demanding, but satisfying, a far cry from the restrictive life she'd led under her father's roof. Here, her competence mattered more than her piety, and Caleb seemed genuinely appreciative of her efforts to bring order to the ranch house. The two-story home was spacious, but had clearly been neglected in recent months. Faith attacked the dust and disorder methodically, room by room, finding unexpected pleasure in transforming the bachelor's quarters into a proper home. Caleb himself remained something of a mystery. He worked from sunrise to sunset, managing the modest herd of cattle and the day-to-day operations of the ranch with quiet efficiency. He was unfailingly polite, even kind, but maintained a certain reserve that Faith was careful to respect. The Garcia brothers, Miguel and Tomas, were more outgoing, especially once they overcame their initial awkwardness around Faith. They seemed to accept her presence without question or judgment, and Faith was grateful for their easy acceptance. "Miss Faith, these biscuits would make angels weep," Miguel declared one evening, reaching for his third helping. "Watch yourself, brother," Tomas teased, "or you'll be too heavy for your horse to carry." Caleb, seated at the head of the table, caught Faith's eye with a small smile that warmed something inside her. These shared meals had quickly become the highlight of her day, so different from the silent, scripture-laden dinners of her childhood. As her fourth month of pregnancy progressed, Faith found herself worrying less about hiding her condition. The loose dresses she favored still concealed the slight rounding of her belly, but she no longer startled at every mention of her future. Something about the open spaces of the ranch, with its endless sky and distant horizons, made her own future seem less constricted. One afternoon, as Faith hung laundry on the line behind the house, she spotted Caleb returning early from the range. He dismounted with the easy grace she'd come to admire, speaking quietly to his horse as he loosened the saddle. "You're back early," she called, pinning one of his shirts to the line. "Finished mending the north fence faster than expected." He led his horse toward the barn, then paused. "Feel like riding out to see the property? Days too nice to waste indoors." Faith hesitated. "I haven't been on a horse since I was 14. My father thought it unladylike." Caleb's expression darkened briefly. "Your father seems to have had many opinions about what women should and shouldn't do." "That's putting it mildly," Faith admitted, surprised by her own candor. "Well, I think every woman living on a ranch should know how to ride," Caleb said. "I've got a gentle mare that would suit you. If you're feeling up to it, that is." His gaze dropped briefly to her midsection, a question in his eyes. It touched Faith that he considered her condition without embarrassment or judgment. "I'm feeling well today, actually. Better than I have in weeks." "Good." His smile was genuine. "I'll saddle up Daisy for you. Finish your laundry and meet me at the barn." 20 minutes later, Faith found herself astride a placid chestnut mare, remembering the feel of a horse beneath her more quickly than she'd expected. Caleb rode beside her on his stallion, pointing out landmarks as they traversed the rolling grassland that made up the heart of the Colton ranch. "That ridge marks the northern boundary," he explained, pointing to a distant rise. "Best grazing land is in the valley beyond those cottonwoods." Faith breathed deeply, taking in the scent of sage and sun-warmed earth. "It's beautiful out here, peaceful." "That's why I stay," Caleb said simply. "Never found this kind of peace in town." They rode in companionable silence for a while, the steady rhythm of the horses' hooves a soothing counterpoint to the whisper of wind through the grass. Faith found herself studying Caleb's profile, the strong line of his jaw relaxed in the afternoon sun, his posture easy in the saddle. For a man who carried the responsibility of an entire ranch on his shoulders, he wore his burdens lightly. "How did you come to be here?" Faith asked suddenly. "Mrs. Wilkins mentioned a Mr. Colton." "Jack Colton," Caleb nodded. "He owned this place for 30 years. I started working for him when I was 16, just a ranch hand like Miguel and Tomas. When Jack's health began to fail and his son showed no interest in ranching, he offered to sell it to me." A fond smile crossed his face. "Said I was the only one he trusted not to ruin what he'd built." "You must have been very young to take on such responsibility." 23, Caleb confirmed. "Scared half to death, but too stubborn to admit it. Jack carried the note for me. I just finished paying him off last year, 2 months before he passed." "I'm sorry for your loss," Faith said softly. "He sounds like he was a good man." "The best," Caleb agreed. "Taught me everything I know about ranching, about being a man, really." He glanced at her. "What about you? Besides a father with too many rules, what was your life like in Las Lunas?" Faith considered the question. No one had asked about her life before, not the parts that mattered anyway. "Confined," she said finally. "As the Reverend's daughter, I was expected to be an example to others. Every action, every word was scrutinized. I helped at the church, taught Sunday school, visited the sick. All worthy things, but not chosen," Caleb finished for her. "No," Faith agreed, surprised by his understanding. "Not chosen." Caleb guided his horse toward a small stream, Daisy following obediently. "And what would you have chosen if you could have?" The question caught Faith off guard. What would she have chosen? The possibilities had seemed so distant, she'd barely allowed herself to consider them. "I think I would have liked to learn more," she said slowly. "Read more books than just the Bible and moral texts. Maybe teach properly, not just Sunday verses." She laughed softly. "I used to sneak the newspaper when my father was done with it, just to read about places I'd never see." "You can see them now," Caleb pointed out. "Once the baby comes and you're on your feet, there's nothing stopping you." Except money, Faith thought but didn't say. Instead, she watched as Caleb dismounted by the stream's edge, offering a hand to help her down. She accepted, trying to ignore the small thrill that ran through her at his touch. "Careful now," he murmured, hands steady at her waist as she found her footing. They let the horses drink while they sat on a large, sun-warmed rock beside the stream. Faith found herself relaxing in a way she rarely did around others, especially men. "You're different from anyone I've ever known, Caleb Simmons," she said after a comfortable silence. He raised an eyebrow. "Is that good or bad?" "Good," Faith said firmly. "Definitely good." His smile in response held something that made her heart beat a little faster. For a moment, she allowed herself to imagine a different life, one where she hadn't made the mistakes she had, where she might have met a man like Caleb under different circumstances. The moment shattered as the baby chose that exact second to move within her, a butterfly light fluttering that took her breath away. "Faith," Caleb's voice held concern. "Are you all right?" "Yes," she whispered, hand going to her belly in wonder. "The baby just moved. I felt it." Caleb's expression softened. "That's a good sign, isn't it?" Faith nodded, tears unexpectedly pricking at her eyes. Until this moment, the baby had been an abstract concept, a condition that had upended her life. Now, with that first flutter of movement, it became real in a way it hadn't been before. "I'm going to be a mother," she said, half to herself. Caleb didn't respond immediately, but when Faith looked up, she found his gaze on her, warm and steady. "You'll be a fine one," he said with quiet conviction. On the ride back to the ranch house, Faith found herself wondering how a man she'd known for such a short time could have such faith in her, when those who had known her all her life had cast her aside so easily. November faded into December. And Faith's pregnancy became impossible to hide as her 5th month rounded her belly, in ways even the loosest dresses couldn't disguise. To her relief, neither Caleb nor the Garcia brothers commented on her changing shape, treating her growing condition as the most natural thing in the world. The winter of 1878 descended on New Mexico with unusual ferocity. Heavy snow blanketed the ranch, transforming the landscape into a glittering white expanse that was beautiful but treacherous. The cattle needed extra attention in the cold, and Caleb often returned from the range with ice crusting his beard and exhaustion lining his face. On those evenings, Faith made sure a hot meal was waiting, along with coffee strong enough to revive a dead man, as Miguel jokingly put it. She found herself watching for Caleb's return each day, her relief at seeing him ride in safely more profound than she cared to admit. 2 weeks before Christmas, a particularly vicious blizzard descended without warning. Faith paced the windows anxiously, watching the snow pile against the glass as daylight faded with no sign of Caleb or the Garcia brothers. When the kitchen door finally burst open, bringing a swirl of snow and 3 half-frozen men, Faith's knees nearly buckled with relief. "Thank God," she breathed, hurrying to take their frozen coats. "I was about to send out a search party, though I'm not sure who that would have been." "Lost 3 head to the ravine," Caleb reported grimly, stomping snow from his boots. "Would have been the whole herd if Miguel hadn't spotted the drift forming." "You men need to warm up," Faith insisted, already pouring mugs of the soup she'd kept simmering. "Sit by the fire before you catch your deaths." The men didn't need to be told twice. Soon they were huddled near the kitchen hearth, color gradually returning to their wind-chapped faces as they recounted the day's struggle against the elements. After the Garcia brothers left for their cabin, Faith busied herself preparing hot water for Caleb's bath, aware of his gaze following her movements around the kitchen. "You don't need to fuss," he said finally. "I've weathered worse storms." "I'm not fussing," Faith retorted, though they both knew she was. "I'm doing my job." Caleb's chuckle was warm in the firelit kitchen. "If you say so." Faith turned to face him, hands on her hips in mock indignation, but the words died on her lips at the intensity in his eyes. "What?" she asked, suddenly self-conscious. "You look beautiful," Caleb said simply, "standing there with the firelight in your hair." Faith felt heat rush to her cheeks that had nothing to do with the hearth. "Don't be ridiculous. I'm as big as a house and you're half frozen from the cold." "Being cold doesn't affect my eyesight," he countered, rising from his chair to step closer to her. "And you're not a house. You're—" He seemed to search for words. "Radiant." Something fluttered in Faith's chest, a feeling as new and startling as the baby's first movements had been. "Caleb," she whispered, unsure what she meant to say next. Whatever might have happened was interrupted by a particularly violent gust of wind that rattled the windows and sent a puff of smoke back down the chimney. The moment broken, Faith stepped back, gesturing toward the stairs. "Your bath water should be ready. You should get warm before you catch a chill." Caleb nodded, the intensity in his gaze softening to something like regret. "Thank you, Faith." Later, lying in her bed listening to the howl of the blizzard outside, Faith placed both hands on her rounded belly and felt the gentle kicks of her child. For the first time since discovering her pregnancy, she allowed herself to imagine a future that wasn't shrouded in uncertainty and fear, a future that, increasingly, included the steady presence of Caleb Simmons. The thought should have frightened her. Instead, it brought a peace that lulled her into the deepest sleep she'd had in months. Christmas approached, bringing a brief respite in the harsh weather. Faith, determined to create some semblance of holiday cheer, spent an afternoon fashioning simple decorations from pine cones, ribbon, and sprigs of evergreen that Tomas collected for her. "My mother used to do this," she explained to Caleb as she arranged her creations on the mantelpiece. "Even when money was tight, she made sure our home felt festive." "It looks nice," Caleb said, watching her work with undisguised admiration. "I can't remember the last time this place was decorated for Christmas." "Well, it should be," Faith declared. "Even on a ranch in the middle of nowhere, Christmas deserves to be celebrated." Caleb smiled at her enthusiasm. "I'm riding into town tomorrow for supplies. Anything special you'd like?" Faith considered, unconsciously cradling her belly. "Some cinnamon would be lovely. And perhaps some dried fruits for baking if Mr. Jensen's store has any." "Consider it done." Caleb hesitated, then added, "I was thinking, would you like to come along? Might do you good to get off the ranch for a bit." Faith stiffened, her hands stilling on the decoration she'd been arranging. "To town? I'm not sure that's wise." Understanding dawned in Caleb's expression. "You're worried about seeing your family, or them seeing me," Faith admitted. "Like this." She gestured to her obviously pregnant form. Caleb's jaw tightened. "You have nothing to be ashamed of, Faith." "Perhaps not in your eyes," she said softly. "But Las Lunas is a small town with a long memory, and my father has considerable influence." "All the more reason not to let him think he's one," Caleb argued, a surprising passion in his voice. "You're living honestly, working hard. Why should you hide away like you've done something wrong?" Faith was touched by his indignation on her behalf, but she shook her head. "It's not about right or wrong anymore, Caleb. It's about peace. I've found it here and I'm not ready to disturb it by facing my past just yet." Caleb studied her for a long moment, then nodded reluctantly. "All right, but the offer stands whenever you're ready." "Thank you," Faith said, returning to her decorations with renewed concentration, hoping he didn't notice the tremble in her hands. That night, unable to sleep, Faith found herself drawn to the kitchen. A cup of warm milk might settle her restless thoughts. To her surprise, a lamp already burned there and Caleb sat at the table, a small knife in his hand as he worked on what appeared to be a piece of wood. He looked up at her entrance, setting aside his project. "Couldn't sleep either." Faith shook her head, moving to the stove to heat some milk. "The baby is particularly active tonight." "May I?" Caleb asked, gesturing to the stove. Faith nodded, allowing him to take over the task while she eased herself into a chair, rubbing the small of her back where an ache had settled. They sat in comfortable silence as Faith sipped the warm milk, feeling the baby gradually settle. "What are you making?" she finally asked, nodding toward the partially carved wood. "Nothing much," Caleb said, almost shyly. "Just a small cradle. Thought the little one might need a place to sleep when it arrives." Faith stared at him, unexpected emotion tightening her throat. "You're making a cradle? For my baby?" "Our babies deserve a proper welcome, no matter the circumstances of their arrival," Caleb said firmly. "My father built one for me, and his father before him. Seems right to continue the tradition." Faith couldn't speak past the lump in her throat. This simple gesture of acceptance, not just of her, but of her child, meant more than any words of comfort ever could. "Thank you," she managed finally. Caleb nodded, seeming to understand all she couldn't say. "It'll be ready in time, I promise." When he returned from town the next day, Caleb brought not only the spices and dried fruits Faith had requested, but also a small bolt of soft flannel in a pale yellow color. "Thought you might want to make something for the baby," he explained a bit gruffly. "Mrs. Jensen at the store said yellow works for boys or girls." Faith ran her fingers over the soft fabric, deeply touched by his thoughtfulness. "It's perfect." "There's something else," Caleb said, reaching into his pocket. He placed a small, paper-wrapped package on the table. "For you, an early Christmas gift." Surprised, Faith carefully unwrapped the package to reveal a slender book of poetry. "It's Tennyson," Caleb explained, watching her face closely. "You mentioned wanting to read more than just religious texts. I thought you might like this." Faith opened the book reverently, skimming the pages with wonder. "I've never owned a book of my own before," she admitted. "My father considered poetry frivolous." "Well, I consider it essential," Caleb said with a small smile. "Everyone needs beauty in their life, especially out here where days can get long and lonely." Faith looked up at him, overcome with gratitude not just for the gift, but for everything he'd done since she arrived on his doorstep that cold night. "I don't know how I'll ever repay your kindness, Caleb." His expression softened. "There's nothing to repay, Faith. Having you here, bringing life back to this old house, that's payment enough." Their eyes held for a long moment, and Faith felt that same flutter in her chest she'd experienced during the blizzard. This time, there was no convenient interruption to break the tension building between them. Slowly, cautiously, Caleb reached out to tuck a stray strand of hair behind her ear, his fingertips lingering against her cheek. Faith found herself leaning into his touch, her eyes closing briefly at the tenderness of the gesture. "Faith," he murmured, his voice rough with an emotion she dared not name. The sound of horses in the yard shattered the moment. Caleb withdrew his hand, stepping back as voices announced the arrival of the Garcia brothers. Faith clutched the book of poetry to her chest, her heart pounding as if she'd run a great distance. Whatever had almost happened, whatever Caleb had been about to say would have to wait. But later that night, reading Tennyson by lamplight, Faith felt a hope growing within her that had nothing to do with poetry and everything to do with the man who had given her shelter when she needed it most. Christmas Day dawned clear and cold, the snow-covered landscape glittering under a bright winter sun. Faith rose early, eager to prepare the special breakfast she'd planned. She moved quietly through the kitchen, mindful not to wake Caleb, whose bedroom was just off the main living area downstairs. Her efforts at silence proved unnecessary when she heard the front door open and close softly. Peering through the window, she spotted Caleb crossing the yard toward the barn, his breath visible in the frigid air. By the time he returned, Faith had coffee brewing and biscuits in the oven. The scent of cinnamon filled the kitchen, a luxury made possible by his trip to town. "Merry Christmas," she greeted him as he stamped snow from his boots. "Merry Christmas," he returned, his smile warming her more thoroughly than the stove. "You're up early." "I wanted to make today special," Faith admitted. "It's my first Christmas away from home." Something like sympathy flickered in Caleb's eyes, but he didn't comment on the sadness that must have been evident in her voice. Instead, he moved to the sink to wash his hands. "It smells amazing in here. What can I do to help?" They worked together preparing breakfast, moving around each other with an ease that spoke of the comfortable routine they'd established over the past months. When the Garcia brothers arrived, boisterous and bearing small gifts wrapped in newspaper, the kitchen filled with laughter and conversation. After the meal, they gathered in the sitting room where Faith's decorations added a festive touch to the usually sparse space. Miguel produced a battered guitar and played Christmas carols while Tomas sang in a surprisingly rich tenor. Faith found herself joining in, memories of childhood Christmases both sweet and painful as she sang the familiar hymns. Caleb watched her from across the room, his expression unreadable. When their eyes met, he offered a small smile that sent warmth spreading through her chest. As the afternoon waned, the Garcia brothers took their leave, heading back to their cabin with promises to return for dinner. In their absence, a comfortable quiet settled over the house. "I have something for you," Caleb said suddenly, rising from his chair. "Wait here." Faith watched curiously as he disappeared into his bedroom, returning moments later with something large covered by a blanket. "It's not quite finished," he said, looking uncharacteristically nervous. "But I wanted you to see it today." He removed the blanket to reveal the cradle he'd been working on, a beautiful piece of craftsmanship made from rich cedar wood. The sides were intricately carved with a pattern of leaves and vines, and the rockers curved gracefully, promising to soothe a fussy infant. "Caleb," Faith breathed, rising to run her fingers over the smooth wood. "It's beautiful. It still needs a finish, and I thought maybe a cushion." He explained, watching her reaction closely. "It's perfect," Faith insisted, tears pricking at her eyes. "More than perfect." Without thinking, she stepped forward and wrapped her arms around his waist, resting her cheek against his chest. She felt him stiffen momentarily in surprise before his arms came around her, one hand cradling the back of her head with infinite gentleness. "Thank you," she whispered against the rough fabric of his shirt. "You're welcome," he murmured, his breath warm against her hair. Faith became acutely aware of their position, her rounded belly pressed against him, his heartbeat steady beneath her ear. She should step back, maintain the proper distance between employer and housekeeper, but she couldn't bring herself to break the embrace. Slowly, Caleb's hand moved to tilt her face upward. Faith met his gaze, reading questions there that made her heart race. "Faith," he said softly, "I don't want to presume, but You're not presuming," she interrupted, finding courage she didn't know she possessed. "Whatever you're thinking, you're not presuming." Something like wonder crossed his face. "I'm thinking I'd very much like to kiss you right now." Faith's breath caught. "Then you should." His lips met hers with a gentleness that made her ache, as if she were something precious that might break under too firm a touch. Faith leaned into the kiss, one hand coming up to rest against his cheek, feeling the slight roughness of stubble beneath her palm. When they parted, Caleb rested his forehead against hers, his hands steady at her waist. "I've been wanting to do that for weeks," he confessed. "Why didn't you?" Faith asked, curious rather than accusing. "Wasn't sure it was right," he admitted. "You came here needing shelter, not complications." Faith smiled, touched by his concern. "I think my life has been quite complicated enough without worrying about one kiss." "Is that all it is?" Caleb asked, his expression growing serious. "Just one kiss?" Faith considered the question, aware they stood at a crossroads. "No," she said finally. "I don't think it is, but I'm not sure what it can be either." Your situation doesn't change how I feel," Caleb interrupted. "Faith, when you showed up on my doorstep that night, I had no idea how completely you'd change my life. This house was just a place to sleep before. Now it feels like a home again. Because I cook and clean," Faith pointed out pragmatically, though her heart raced at his words. "Because you're in it," Caleb corrected. "Your laugh, your quiet strength, the way you hum when you think no one's listening. I'm not asking for promises or commitments. I just want you to know that whatever happens when the baby comes, you have a place here. With me, if you want it." Faith felt tears well in her eyes at the simplicity of his offer. No demands, no expectations, just the quiet assurance that she wasn't alone. "I'm carrying another man's child," she reminded him, needing to be absolutely clear. Caleb's expression didn't waver. "A child who will need love and care just like its mother. I'm offering both, Faith, to both of you." Faith searched his face, looking for any sign of doubt or hesitation. Finding none, she felt something settle within her, a certainty she hadn't experienced since before her world turned upside down. "Then I accept," she said softly. "Whatever this is between us, I want to see where it leads." Caleb's answering smile was like sunrise breaking over the mountain, slow, radiant, inevitable. When he kissed her again, Faith felt as though she'd finally found her way home after a long and difficult journey. January brought bitter cold and the constant threat of snow, but inside the ranch house, warmth prevailed. Faith's pregnancy advanced into its 6th month, bringing with it more pronounced movements from the baby and a new roundness to her figure that even the loosest clothing couldn't disguise. The change in her relationship with Caleb was both subtle and profound. He remained respectful of her space and independence, but small gestures of affection now punctuated their days, a touch to her shoulder as he passed, his hand covering hers at the dinner table, a kiss good morning or good night that never presumed more than she was ready to give. Faith found herself blossoming under his quiet devotion, discovering aspects of herself she'd never been allowed to explore under her father's rigid control. She read voraciously from Caleb's modest library, discussed ideas with him in the evenings, and even learned to ride with increasing confidence despite her growing belly. The Garcia brothers observed the developing relationship with knowing smiles but respectful discretion, treating Faith with a protective deference that touched her deeply. "Miss Faith," Miguel said one evening as he helped her carry firewood, "the boss has smiled more these past 2 months than in the 2 years before you came. Whatever you're doing, keep doing it." Faith blushed but didn't deny the observation. "He's a good man." "The best," Miguel agreed. "And he deserves happiness after everything." Faith paused, curious. "What do you mean, after everything?" Miguel looked suddenly uncomfortable, as if realizing he'd said too much. "It's not my place to talk about the boss's business." "Of course," Faith said quickly. "I didn't mean to pry." But the conversation left her wondering what sorrows might lie in Caleb's past. For all their growing closeness, he rarely spoke of his life before the ranch, and Faith had been too consumed with her own troubles to question the omission. That night, as they sat by the fire after dinner, Faith found herself studying Caleb's profile as he read the newspaper. The flickering light accentuated the strong lines of his face, but also the slight furrow between his brows that never quite disappeared, even when he smiled. "What?" he asked, catching her gaze. "Just thinking," Faith replied, setting aside her mending. "I realized today that for all we've shared, I know very little about your life before we met." Caleb folded the newspaper, his expression thoughtful rather than defensive. "Not much to tell. I grew up north of Santa Fe on a small farm, left home at 16 to find work, ended up here with Jack Colton, and never left." "And your family?" Faith pressed gently. A shadow crossed his face. "My parents died of influenza when I was 15. Had a younger sister, Sarah, who married and moved to Santa Fe, like I mentioned before." "I'm sorry about your parents," Faith said softly. "It must have been difficult losing them so young." Caleb nodded, his gaze fixed on the fire. "It was, but it taught me to make my own way." He hesitated, then added, "There was someone once in town, Constance Weber. We were to be married." Faith felt a small twist of jealousy, immediately followed by concern at the past tense. "What happened?" "She died," Caleb said simply. "Childbirth, her and the baby both." Faith's hand flew to her mouth, understanding now Miguel's cryptic reference. "Oh, Caleb, I'm so sorry." "It was 5 years ago," he said, his voice deliberately even, "before I bought the ranch from Jack. She was the banker's daughter. Mr. Weber thought I wasn't good enough for her, but she didn't care about that." Faith reached for his hand, twining her fingers with his. "She sounds brave." She was. A sad smile touched his lips. "Stubborn too, refused to let her father choose her life for her." His eyes met Faith's. "Reminded me of you that way." The comparison warmed her but also sent a chill of foreboding down her spine. "Is that why you've been so concerned about my condition? Because of what happened to her?" Caleb's hand tightened around hers. "I won't deny it crossed my mind." Childbirth is dangerous, Faith, out here especially with the doctor in town miles away. I'm healthy, Faith reassured him, and this baby is strong, I can feel it. I believe you, Caleb said, though worry still shadowed his eyes. But when the time comes, I want the doctor here. No arguments. Faith nodded, understanding his fear was born of past loss. No arguments. They sat in silence for a moment, the fire crackling softly in the hearth. Finally, Caleb spoke again. After Constance died, I thought that part of my life was over. Couldn't imagine feeling that way about anyone again. His gaze, when it met hers, held a vulnerability she'd never seen in him before. Then you showed up on my doorstep and everything changed. Faith felt tears prick at her eyes. I came here with nothing, Caleb. No future, no plan beyond the next day. You gave me hope when I needed it most. You gave me purpose, he countered. A reason to make this place more than just a ranch. He reached out to brush a tear from her cheek. I don't want to rush you, Faith. I know your situation is complicated and your heart might still be tied to the man who— It's not, Faith interrupted firmly. Edward made promises he never intended to keep. I was foolish to believe him, but my heart was never truly engaged. She placed a hand over her rounded belly. I will always be grateful for this child, but I hold no love for its father. Relief flickered across Caleb's features. Good to know. Faith smiled, shifting closer to lean against his shoulder. Tell me more about your family farm. Was it beautiful? And so he did, painting pictures with words of the cottonwood trees that lined the irrigation ditches, the mountains visible from the kitchen window, the smell of his mother's bread baking on winter mornings. Faith listened, soaking in these pieces of him, this history that had shaped the man who now shaped her future. Later, as he walked her to her bedroom door, Caleb cupped her face in his calloused hands and kissed her with a tenderness that spoke volumes. Rest well, he murmured. You too, Faith replied, reluctant to break the moment. As she settled into bed, her hands resting on her belly where the baby turned and kicked, Faith reflected on how drastically her life had changed in the span of a few short months. The disgrace and banishment that had seemed like the end of everything had instead become the beginning of something precious and unexpected. For the first time, she found herself grateful for the path that had led her to Caleb's door, hardships and all. February arrived with a brief thaw that turned the ranch yard into a sea of mud. Faith, now in her 7th month, found herself increasingly restless within the confines of the house, her body growing heavier and more ungainly by the day. You're pacing like a caged mountain lion, Caleb observed one afternoon, watching her move from window to window. Cabin fever setting in. Is it that obvious? Faith smiled ruefully. I feel like I haven't seen anything beyond these walls in weeks. The mud's starting to dry up, Caleb noted. Why don't we take a ride out tomorrow if the weather holds? Not far, just enough to get you some fresh air. Faith brightened at the suggestion. I'd like that, though I'm not sure how dignified I'll look climbing onto a horse in my condition. Dignity's overrated, Caleb grinned. Besides, no one out here to see but me and the cattle, and neither of us is likely to judge. The next morning dawned clear and mild, perfect for their planned excursion. Faith dressed in her warmest clothes, grateful for the loose shirtwaist that still accommodated her growing form. When she came downstairs, she found Caleb waiting with a picnic basket. Mrs. Rodriguez from the next ranch overbrought sweet bread yesterday, he explained. Thought we might make a proper outing of it. The thoughtfulness of the gesture touched Faith deeply. That sounds wonderful. With Caleb's help, she mounted Daisy, finding a comfortable position despite her awkward shape. They rode at an easy pace, following a gentle trail that wound through a stand of cottonwoods toward a small mesa that offered views of the surrounding countryside. The February sun was warm on Faith's face as they traveled, the world around them beginning to show the first subtle signs of approaching spring. Tiny green shoots pushed through the soil in sheltered spots, and the air carried a freshness that had been absent during the depths of winter. "I never thought I'd enjoy riding so much," Faith admitted as they reached the base of the mesa. "My father always said it was unladylike to straddle a horse." Caleb snorted. "Your father seems to have had a lot of opinions about what makes a proper lady." "That he did," Faith agreed with a wry smile. "Most of which I've managed to violate spectacularly over the past few months." "And yet," Caleb observed, helping her dismount at their destination, "you've become more yourself, not less." The insight startled Faith. "What do you mean?" Caleb shrugged, spreading a blanket on a flat rock for their picnic. "Just that when you first arrived you seemed careful, like you were always watching your words, measuring yourself against some invisible standard. Now you speak your mind, laugh when something's funny, argue when you disagree with me." "I argue with you?" Faith asked, settling onto the blanket with his assistance. "Frequently," Caleb confirmed, his eyes twinkling. "Just yesterday you told me my method for making coffee was an affront to God and man alike." Faith laughed, remembering. "Well, it is. You use far too many grounds. See, that right there." Caleb sat beside her, unpacking the basket. "The Faith who arrived on my doorstep would never have said such a thing to her benefactor." "You're not my benefactor," Faith protested. "You're my." She trailed off, unsure how to define their relationship. "You're what?" Caleb prompted gently, handing her a slice of sweet bread. Faith met his gaze directly. "My future, I hope." The simple declaration hung in the air between them, more significant than any passionate speech could have been. Caleb's expression softened, his eyes warming with an emotion that made Faith's heart skip. "I'd like that very much," he said quietly. They ate in companionable silence, gazing out over the expanse of grassland and distant mountains. The vastness of the landscape put Faith's troubles in perspective: her father's rejection, the gossip of Las Lunas, even the uncertainty of her future as an unwed mother seemed smaller against the backdrop of this enduring land. "I've been thinking," Caleb said finally, setting aside his empty plate. "About the baby and what happens after." Faith tensed slightly. Despite their growing closeness, they had carefully avoided discussing long-term plans. "Oh, I want you to stay," Caleb said simply. "Not as my housekeeper, but as my wife, if you'll have me." Faith stared at him, momentarily speechless. Of all the ways she'd imagined this conversation unfolding, this direct approach hadn't been one of them. "Caleb," she began, "are you certain? The child isn't yours and people will talk, let them," he interrupted. "Faith, I've lived in this territory long enough to know what matters. It's not what people say about you that counts, but who stands beside you when things get hard." He took her hand, his grip warm and steady. "I want to stand beside you and your child if you'll let me." Faith felt tears well in her eyes. "You would claim another man's child as your own." "I would love any child of yours as my own," Caleb corrected. "And I would count myself blessed to be called its father." The sincerity in his voice was unmistakable. This wasn't pity or obligation, but something far deeper and more genuine. Faith found herself overcome with a gratitude so profound it bordered on pain. "You should know," she said shakily, "that I've fallen in love with you, Caleb Simmons, completely and foolishly in love." A slow smile spread across his face. "Well, that works out conveniently, since I've been in love with you since about 2 weeks after you arrived." Faith laughed through her tears. 2 weeks? I was still barely speaking to you then." "Quality over quantity," Caleb quipped, then grew serious again. "Faith Harper, will you marry me? Be my wife, let me be a father to your child, grow old with me on this ranch. Yes, Faith whispered, then more firmly. Yes, I will. Caleb's kiss was tender but carried a promise of passion that made Faith's cheeks flush. When they parted, he rested one hand gently on her belly, his expression one of wonder as he felt the baby kick against his palm. Strong, he commented, like its mother. Or stubborn, Faith suggested with a smile, like its future father. As they packed up their picnic and prepared for the ride home, Faith felt a profound sense of rightness settle over her. The path that had led her here had been difficult and painful, but standing on this mesa with the man she loved, she couldn't bring herself to regret a single step of the journey. The weeks that followed were filled with quiet preparation. Caleb rode into town to speak with the minister at the small Episcopal church, who agreed to perform the ceremony once Faith's condition permitted travel. Unlike Faith's father, Reverend Thomas was known for his compassion rather than his judgment, and Caleb returned from their meeting with renewed optimism. He said he would be honored to join us in matrimony, Caleb reported, and that God's love encompasses all families however they come to be. Faith, sewing tiny garments from the yellow flannel Caleb had given her for Christmas, felt a weight lift from her shoulders at his words. That's a far cry from what my father would say. Your father's loss, Caleb said firmly, and our gain. As Faith's 8th month of pregnancy began, Caleb insisted on riding into town to fetch Dr. Mitchell for a consultation. The doctor, a gruff but kind man in his 60s, examined Faith thoroughly before pronouncing both mother and child to be in excellent health. First babies often come late, he advised before departing. But send for me at the first sign of labor. I'll come no matter the hour or weather. Caleb nodded seriously, clearly relieved by the doctor's assessment but still anxious about the impending birth. You heard him, Faith teased gently after the doctor had gone. Healthy as a horse, both of us. I still worry, Caleb admitted. Can't help it. Faith reached for his hand. I know. But women have been doing this since the beginning of time, Caleb. Trust that I can do it too. March arrived with milder weather and the first real signs of spring. The ranch came alive with new activity as calving season began, keeping Caleb and the Garcia brothers busy from dawn until dusk. Faith, now heavily pregnant, focused on preparing the house for the baby's arrival, washing and folding the tiny garments she'd sewn, and placing Caleb's beautifully finished cradle near her bed. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Faith felt a strange tightening in her belly. She shifted uncomfortably, drawing Caleb's attention. Are you all right? Just practice contractions, I think, Faith assured him. Dr. Mitchell said they're common at this stage. Caleb nodded, but his hand found hers and held it tightly. They had planned to marry once the baby was born, and Faith had recovered her strength. But Faith sometimes wondered if they should have wed immediately. Propriety be damned. The thought of something happening to her, leaving her child without the protection of Caleb's name, troubled her more than she let on. As if reading her thoughts, Caleb spoke. I've been thinking we should go ahead and marry Faith before the baby comes. Faith looked at him in surprise. Are you sure? It would mean traveling to town and in my condition. We could ask Reverend Thomas to come here, Caleb suggested. I'd feel better knowing it was done, that you and the baby had my name, my protection, no matter what happens. The same fears that had haunted Faith clearly troubled him as well. She squeezed his hand reassuringly. If that's what you want, then yes. Let's not wait. Relief washed over Caleb's features. I'll ride into town tomorrow, speak to the Reverend. 3 days later, Reverend Thomas arrived at the ranch in a small buggy. Faith, wearing her best dress let out considerably to accommodate her advanced pregnancy, stood beside Caleb in the sitting room as the minister performed a simple but heartfelt ceremony. The Garcia brothers served as witnesses, Miguel's wife Maria having come to help prepare a special wedding dinner. The small gathering felt more genuinely joyful than any elaborate church wedding could have been, surrounded as they were by people who truly cared for them. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," Reverend Thomas declared with a warm smile. "Mr. and Mrs. Caleb Simmons." Caleb's kiss was gentle but filled with promise, his hand steady at the small of Faith's back. Looking into his eyes, Faith knew with absolute certainty that this was where she belonged, not in her father's restrictive household, not with the smooth-talking railroad man who had abandoned her, but here, with this steadfast cowboy who had opened his door and his heart when she needed it most. That night, as Faith prepared for bed now in the larger bedroom she would share with Caleb, she caught sight of her reflection in the mirror. Her body had changed dramatically over the past months, rounding and softening in ways that still sometimes startled her. But beyond the physical transformation, she hardly recognized the woman who gazed back at her. This Faith stood straighter, met her own eyes directly, carried herself with a quiet confidence that had been absent before. This Faith had survived rejection, had built a new life from nothing, had found love where she least expected it. "My wife," Caleb said softly from the doorway, his voice filled with wonder. "I still can't quite believe it." Faith turned to him, smiling. "Believe it? I'm yours and you're mine, and soon there will be three of us." He crossed to her, placing both hands gently on her rounded belly. "I can't wait to meet this little one." As if in response, the baby kicked vigorously, making them both laugh. "I think the feeling is mutual," Faith said, covering his hands with her own. Their first night as husband and wife was spent in quiet conversation and tender embraces, both understanding that more intimate expressions of their love would wait until after the baby's arrival. Just being together, officially bound as family, brought a peace that neither had expected to find again. A week later, Faith woke in the pre-dawn darkness to a sharp pain that took her breath away. She lay still, waiting to see if it would return, and was answered minutes later by another contraction that left no doubt. "Caleb," she whispered, touching his shoulder. "It's time." He was instantly alert, years of responding to emergencies on the ranch serving him well in this moment. "Are you certain?" Faith nodded, another contraction building. "Very certain." Caleb was out of bed in an instant, pulling on his clothes. "I'll send Tomas for the doctor and Maria to help until he arrives." He paused, looking suddenly lost despite his initial efficiency. "What do you need now?" "Water, extra blankets." Despite her discomfort, Faith smiled at his anxiety. "Water would be good, and maybe help me walk a bit. Dr. Mitchell said walking can help in the early stages." Caleb nodded, grateful for the concrete task. By the time he returned with water, Faith was already up, pacing slowly around the bedroom, one hand supporting her lower back. The next few hours passed in a blur of increasing pain and focused breathing. Maria arrived, bringing quiet competence and gentle encouragement. She helped Faith change into a loose nightgown and arranged the bed with clean linens for the delivery. "The baby is coming faster than I expected for a first-timer," she commented after checking Faith's progress. "Your body knows what to do, Senora." Caleb remained by Faith's side throughout, wiping her brow with a cool cloth, supporting her through each contraction, murmuring encouragement when the pain became almost unbearable. His presence anchored her, giving her strength when her own began to flag. By mid-morning, Dr. Mitchell still hadn't arrived, and Faith's labor had progressed to the point where Maria exchanged a meaningful look with Caleb. "The doctor may not make it in time," she said quietly. But do not worry. I have helped deliver many babies. All is proceeding normally. Caleb's face paled, but he nodded. Whatever Faith needs. What I need, Faith gasped between contractions, is for this baby to be born. Soon, Querida, Maria promised. Very soon now. An hour later, with a final tremendous effort, Faith brought her child into the world. The sound of a healthy, indignant cry filled the room, bringing tears to her eyes. A boy, Maria announced, quickly cleaning and wrapping the infant. A beautiful, strong boy. She placed the swaddled newborn in Faith's arms. Faith stared down at the tiny face, overcome with a love so powerful it seemed to radiate from her very core. The baby had a shock of dark hair, and when he briefly opened his eyes, Faith glimpsed a deep blue that might eventually turn brown. "Hello, little one," she whispered. "We've been waiting for you." Caleb sat beside her on the edge of the bed, his expression one of awe as he gently touched the baby's cheek with one finger. "He's perfect, Faith, absolutely perfect." "Would you like to hold your son?" Faith asked softly. Caleb's eyes met hers at the word son, understanding the gift she was offering. With careful movements, he took the baby into his arms, cradling him with a tenderness that made Faith's heart swell. "What shall we call him?" he asked, not taking his eyes off the infant's face. Faith had given this much thought in recent weeks. "I was thinking, Daniel, after your father." Caleb looked up, surprise and emotion plain on his face. "You remembered." "Of course I did," Faith said. "Daniel Caleb Simmons, a strong name for a strong boy." "Daniel," Caleb repeated, testing the name. "It suits him." Maria slipped quietly from the room, giving the new family privacy for these precious first moments together. Faith watched as Caleb whispered promises to the baby, promises of protection, of guidance, of unconditional love, and knew that whatever hardships might lie ahead, they would face them together, the three of them. Dr. Mitchell arrived an hour later, full of apologies about a broken wagon wheel that had delayed his journey. He examined both mother and baby thoroughly, pronouncing them healthy and strong. "You've done well, Mrs. Simmons," he said, packing up his bag. "Rest now and let your husband take care of you both." As the doctor departed, Faith felt exhaustion wash over her. Caleb, who had placed little Daniel in his cradle, returned to sit beside her, taking her hand in his. "You should sleep," he said gently. "I'll watch over him." "Promise you'll wake me when he needs to eat," Faith murmured, already drifting toward slumber. "I promise," Caleb assured her. "Faith, thank you for our son, for making me a father." Faith squeezed his hand weakly. "Thank you for making us a family when no one else would." As she slipped into sleep, Faith carried with her the image of Caleb standing by the cradle, watching over their son with a devotion that erased all boundaries of blood and circumstance. In that moment, she knew that the door he had opened to her that cold November night had led not just to shelter, but to a love greater than she could ever have imagined. Spring blossomed across the ranch as Daniel grew from newborn to infant. Faith recovered her strength quickly, surprising even Dr. Mitchell with her resilience. By the time Daniel was 6 weeks old, she had resumed most of her duties around the house, though Caleb insisted she rest whenever possible. "The chores will still be there tomorrow," he would say, taking Daniel from her arms when he saw fatigue in her eyes. "Go lie down for a while." These moments watching Caleb with their son became Faith's greatest joy. He approached fatherhood with the same steady competence he brought to everything, seemingly untroubled by tasks that might have daunted other men. He changed diapers without complaint, walked the floor with Daniel when he was fussy, and insisted on taking the baby for early morning hours so Faith could sleep. "He's a natural," Maria commented one afternoon as they watched Caleb in the yard, pointing out a red-tailed hawk to the baby who was far too young to appreciate the sight. "Some men avoid babies until they can talk, but not your husband. He's making up for lost time, I think," Faith replied. His own father died when he was young. The ranch flourished that spring as well. The calving season had been successful, and Caleb spoke of expanding their herd if market prices held steady. The Garcia brothers had begun work on a new corral, and there was talk of adding a room to the house now that their family had grown. As April turned to May, Faith found herself contemplating a journey she both dreaded and knew was necessary. One evening, as they sat on the porch after putting Daniel to bed, she broached the subject with Caleb. "I think it's time I went into Las Lunas," she said, watching his profile in the fading light. "My parents should know they have a grandson." Caleb turned to her, his expression cautious. "Are you sure that's wise? Your father's words were pretty final from what you've told me." "I know," Faith acknowledged, "and I don't expect him to welcome me back with open arms. But my mother, she might want to know Daniel even if my father forbids it." Caleb considered this, then nodded slowly. "If that's what you want, I'll take you, but I won't let him hurt you again, Faith, not with words or anything else." The protectiveness in his voice warmed her. "I know you won't. Besides, I'm not the same woman who left there 6 months ago. His words can't touch me the way they once did." The following Sunday, they set out for Las Lunas in the wagon, Daniel securely bundled in Faith's arms despite the mild spring weather. Faith had dressed in her best, a new dress Caleb had ordered for her from a catalog as a gift after Daniel's birth. She wore her hair up in a mature style, completing the transformation from the frightened girl who had fled the parsonage to the confident young wife and mother she had become. As they approached the outskirts of town, Faith felt a flutter of anxiety in her stomach. "Perhaps this is a mistake," she murmured. Caleb's hand covered hers. "We can turn back if you want, or I can go with you to the parsonage." Faith shook her head. "No, this is something I need to do myself. Would you mind waiting with Daniel near the church? Sunday services should be ending soon." Caleb agreed, though reluctance was clear in his expression. They timed their arrival to coincide with the end of the morning service, and Faith saw people beginning to file out of the small white church as they pulled up across the street. "I won't be long," she promised, handing Daniel to Caleb. One way or another. With a deep breath, Faith crossed the street, conscious of curious glances from former neighbors and congregation members. She heard whispers as she passed, but kept her head high, her destination clear. Her mother emerged from the church on her father's arm, looking exactly as Faith remembered, yet somehow smaller, more fragile. Reverend Harper was deep in conversation with a deacon, his stern profile unchanged by the months that had passed. "Mother," Faith called softly as she approached. Martha Harper turned, her eyes widening in shock as she recognized her daughter. "Faith," she whispered, one hand flying to her throat. "Is it really you?" "It's me," Faith confirmed, coming to stand before them. Her father had noticed now. His conversation abruptly ceased as he stared at Faith with an expression that mingled surprise and displeasure. "What are you doing here?" he demanded. "You are no longer welcome in God's house." "I didn't come for your permission to enter the church, Father," Faith replied evenly. "I came because I thought my mother might want to know she has a grandson." Martha Harper's gaze darted to her husband's face, then back to Faith's. "A boy?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "You had a boy?" Faith nodded. "Daniel, he's 2 months old now, healthy and strong." She hesitated, then added, "And I'm married. To a good man who loves both me and my child as his own." Her father's expression hardened. "Married? Who would take on another man's—" "Joshua, please," Martha interrupted, a rare defiance in her tone. "She's our daughter. She made her choice. Reverend Harper retorted, but some of the fire had gone out of his voice. Faith met his gaze steadily. Yes, I did. And I've found more happiness in that choice than I ever knew was possible. She turned to her mother. Would you like to meet your grandson, Mother? He's just across the street with my husband. Martha glanced at her husband, a silent plea in her eyes. After a long moment, Reverend Harper gave a curt nod. 5 minutes, Martha. Then we have obligations to the congregation. It wasn't forgiveness or acceptance, but it was something. Faith led her mother across the street to where Caleb waited with Daniel, his tall figure drawing curious glances from the dispersing churchgoers. Mother, this is my husband, Caleb Simmons, Faith introduced. Caleb, my mother, Martha Harper. Madam, Caleb greeted respectfully, shifting Daniel in his arms so she could see the baby's face. Martha gasped softly, her eyes filling with tears as she looked at her grandson for the first time. Oh, Faith, he's beautiful. Would you like to hold him? Faith offered. Martha nodded wordlessly, accepting the bundled infant with practiced ease. She cooed softly to Daniel, who regarded her with solemn blue eyes. He looks like you did as a baby, she whispered. Same eyes, same little chin. Faith felt a lump form in her throat at the tenderness in her mother's voice. He's a good baby, hardly ever cries unless he's hungry or tired. Martha looked up from Daniel's face to study Caleb more carefully. You're the rancher from the Colton place, aren't you? Yes, madam, Caleb confirmed. Faith and I were married 2 months ago, just before Daniel was born. Something in his straightforward manner seemed to reassure Martha. Thank you, she said softly, for taking care of my daughter when I failed to. Mother, no, Faith protested. You did what you could. It wasn't enough, Martha said firmly. A mother should protect her child no matter what. Across the street, Reverend Harper stood watching them, his expression unreadable. Faith knew better than to expect a reconciliation, at least not today, but the fact that he had allowed this brief meeting felt like a small victory. We should go, Faith said gently, noting her father's impatient stance. But perhaps we could write to each other. I'd like Daniel to know his grandmother. Martha returned the baby to Faith's arms, visibly reluctant to let him go. I would like that very much. I can't promise your father will approve, but send your letters to Mrs. Rodriguez at the next ranch over, Caleb suggested. She comes by often with eggs and such. She can bring them to Faith. Gratitude flashed in Martha's eyes at this offer of discretion. Thank you, Mr. Simmons. She turned back to Faith, reaching out to touch her cheek briefly. You look well, my dear. Happy. I am, Mother, Faith assured her. Truly happy. As Martha returned to her husband's side, Faith felt a curious mix of emotions, regret for what might have been, but also peace about the path she had chosen. Her father might never accept her choices, but she had created a family of her own, one built on love and acceptance rather than rigid judgment. The ride home was quiet, Faith lost in thoughts of the encounter, Caleb respectful of her need to process the experience. Daniel slept peacefully in her arms, unaware of the complex family dynamics he had just been introduced to. Are you all right? Caleb asked finally as the ranch came into view. Faith considered the question. Yes, she said with quiet certainty. I am. It wasn't the reconciliation I might have hoped for, but it was something, a beginning maybe. Your mother clearly loves you, Caleb observed, and she's smitten with Daniel already. Yes, Faith smiled, looking down at their sleeping son. I think she'll find a way to be part of his life, even if my father never comes around. As they pulled up to the ranch house, their home, Faith felt a profound sense of gratitude wash over her. 6 months ago, she had arrived here desperate and alone, with nothing but a small bag of possessions and an unborn child. Now she returned as Faith Simmons, wife and mother, surrounded by love she had never dared to dream might be hers. That night, after Daniel was settled in his cradle, Faith found Caleb on the porch, gazing up at the star-filled sky. She slipped her arms around his waist from behind, resting her cheek against his back. "Thank you," she murmured. He turned in her embrace to face her. "For what?" "For saying those words to me that night. My door is always open wide, for meaning them." She looked up into his face, illuminated by the soft glow from the window. "For loving me and Daniel as if we were always meant to be yours." Caleb's arms tightened around her. "You were," he said simply. "Both of you. I just had to wait for you to find your way here." His kiss held all the promise of their shared future, the years stretching ahead filled with Daniel's growth, perhaps more children, the steady rhythm of ranch life through changing seasons. Faith surrendered to it completely, knowing she had finally found where she belonged. Summer passed in a golden haze of long days and warm nights. Daniel grew steadily, his personality emerging more clearly with each passing week. He had Faith's blue eyes and fair coloring, but a determined temperament that Caleb insisted must have come from her as well. "Stubborn as a mule," he would say fondly as Daniel refused a spoonful of mashed carrots for the third time. "Just like his mama." "I prefer to call it determined," Faith would retort with a smile, wiping orange mush from Daniel's chin. Letters from Martha arrived regularly via Mrs. Rodriguez, bringing news of Las Lunas and careful inquiries about Daniel's development. Faith responded with detailed accounts of his first smile, his attempts to roll over, the strength in his tiny hands when he grabbed her fingers. She never mentioned her father, and Martha's careful omission of him in her own letters told Faith all she needed to know about Reverend Harper's continuing stance. But the absence of her father's approval no longer cast a shadow over Faith's happiness. Her world had expanded beyond the narrow confines of the parsonage to encompass the vast beauty of the ranch, the warm community they had built with the Garcia family and neighboring ranchers, and most of all, the deep and steadfast love she shared with Caleb. As Daniel approached his 6-month birthday in September, Caleb surprised Faith with news that he had purchased additional acreage adjoining the ranch. "The Petersons decided to move back east," he explained over dinner. "Offered me first chance at their land before putting it on the market. It's good grazing land, and there's a small cabin that could work as a line shack during calving season." "That's wonderful news," Faith said, genuinely pleased by his success. "The ranch is growing, just like our family." Caleb's eyes held a particular warmth as they met hers across the table. "Speaking of our family growing." Faith felt a blush rise to her cheeks. Since Daniel's birth and her complete recovery, their marriage had blossomed in all ways, including the intimate connection they shared in the privacy of their bedroom. "Are you asking if we might be expecting another little Simmons?" "The thought had crossed my mind," Caleb admitted with a smile. Faith shook her head, though not without a touch of wistfulness. "Not yet, but perhaps soon. I'd like Daniel to have brothers and sisters close in age." "I'd like that too," Caleb agreed, reaching across the table to take her hand. "A house full of children, all as beautiful and strong as their mother." "And as kind and steady as their father," Faith added softly. The moment was interrupted by Daniel's demands from his cradle in the corner, his timing impeccable as always. Faith rose to tend to him, lifting his sturdy little body into her arms with practiced ease. "There now, little man," she soothed. "No need for such a fuss." Caleb watched them with undisguised love in his eyes. "I never thought I could be this happy again," he said quietly. "After Constance died, I figured that was it for me. Just the ranch and my work, growing old alone." Faith sat beside him, settling Daniel on her lap. And I never imagined finding someone who could love me despite my mistakes, who would claim another man's child as his own. She leaned against his shoulder. We saved each other, I think. October brought cooler weather and preparations for winter. Caleb and the Garcia brothers worked long hours ensuring the ranch was ready for the coming cold, while Faith preserved the last of the garden's bounty and turned her attention to making warmer clothes for Daniel, who seemed to grow an inch overnight. One crisp morning, as Faith hung laundry on the line, she spotted a buggy approaching from the direction of Las Lunas. Visitors were uncommon, especially as winter approached, and she shaded her eyes to better make out who might be calling. As the buggy drew closer, Faith felt her heart skip a beat. The woman seated beside the driver was unmistakably her mother. But it was the other figure, stiff-backed and somber, that truly shocked her Reverend Joshua Harper, making his first journey to the Simmons ranch. Faith hurried inside to where Caleb was bouncing Daniel on his knee, the baby's delighted giggles filling the kitchen. "My parents are here," she said breathlessly. "Both of them." Caleb's eyebrows rose in surprise, but he nodded calmly. "Then we'll receive them as family should." By the time Faith returned to the yard, the buggy had pulled up, and the driver, whom Faith now recognized as Deacon Williams from her father's church, was helping Martha down from the seat. Reverend Harper descended on his own, his gaze taking in the ranch house and surrounding buildings with an assessing eye. "Mother, Father," Faith greeted, approaching them with more confidence than she felt. "This is unexpected." "Faith," Martha stepped forward to embrace her daughter. "You're looking well. Is that my grandson I hear inside?" "Yes, Caleb's entertaining him," Faith confirmed, returning her mother's embrace before turning to her father. "Hello, Father," Reverend Harper nodded stiffly. "Faith." An awkward silence fell, broken only when the kitchen door opened and Caleb emerged with Daniel in his arms. He descended the porch steps to join them, his expression welcoming despite the tension in the air. "Reverend and Mrs. Harper," he greeted. "Welcome to our home. Please, come inside out of the wind." Martha immediately moved to take Daniel, cooing over how much he had grown since she'd seen him in May. Faith led the way into the house, acutely aware of her father's scrutiny as he took in the modest but comfortable home she and Caleb had built together. Once inside, with coffee served and Daniel settled on a blanket on the floor with a wooden toy Caleb had carved for him, Reverend Harper finally spoke directly to Faith. "Your mother has been showing me your letters," he said, his tone measured. "She seems to think I've been too harsh in my judgment." Faith glanced at her mother, surprised by this unexpected advocacy. "I see." "I don't condone what happened," Reverend Harper continued. "The choices you made were sinful, Faith. That hasn't changed." "With respect, sir," Caleb interrupted, his voice firm but not confrontational. "My wife has shown more courage and grace in the face of adversity than many who claim to stand in judgment. She's a wonderful mother and partner, and I won't have her past mistakes thrown in her face, not even by her father." Faith placed a restraining hand on Caleb's arm, touched by his defense but recognizing the delicate nature of this conversation. "It's all right, Caleb. Father is entitled to his opinion." Reverend Harper studied Caleb with newfound interest. "You love my daughter." It wasn't a question, but Caleb answered anyway, "With all my heart, and I love our son just as much." "Our son," Reverend Harper repeated, his gaze moving to Daniel, who was happily gumming the wooden toy on his blanket. "Not by blood, I understand. By choice," Caleb said simply, "which matters a great deal more in my experience." A long silence followed as Reverend Harper seemed to digest this. Finally, he sighed heavily. "The Bible teaches forgiveness," he said, as if coming to a difficult conclusion. "And family duty. The boy is my grandson regardless of circumstances, and you are still my daughter, Faith." Faith felt tears prick at her eyes, understanding that this was as close to an apology or reconciliation as her proud father could manage. "Yes, I am." Martha reached across to squeeze her husband's hand, a gesture of support that spoke volumes about the discussions that must have led to this visit. "We would like to be part of your lives," she said, looking from Faith to Caleb. "If you'll allow it." "Daniel should know his grandparents," Caleb said, looking to Faith for confirmation. Faith nodded, overwhelmed by the unexpected turn of events. "We would like that very much." The visit lasted several hours, the initial tension gradually easing as Daniel worked his charm on his grandfather. By the time Reverend Harper held the baby on his knee, awkwardly bouncing him as Martha instructed, Faith could see the ice in his expression had completely melted. "He has your eyes," he admitted to Faith. "Strong boy, too. Good grip." "He'll make a fine horseman someday," Caleb predicted, pride evident in his voice. When the time came for her parents to leave, Faith walked them to their buggy, Daniel balanced on her hip. The goodbye was stilted but not cold, with promises to visit again before the winter weather made travel difficult. "Thank you for coming, Father," Faith said as he prepared to climb into the buggy. "It means more than I can say." Reverend Harper paused, then reached out to touch Daniel's cheek briefly. "Family is important," he said gruffly. "The Lord teaches us that above all." As the buggy pulled away, Faith felt Caleb's arm slip around her waist. "You all right?" he asked quietly. "Better than all right," Faith assured him, leaning into his embrace. "I never thought I'd see my father hold my son. It wasn't forgiveness exactly, but it was acceptance of a sort." "It's a start," Caleb agreed, "and who knows? Maybe by the time we have our next child, he'll have come around completely." Faith turned in his arms to face him, a smile playing at her lips. "Our next child? You seem very confident about that." "Well, unless I'm mistaken," Caleb said, his eyes twinkling, "we've been practicing the necessary activities quite diligently." Faith laughed, the sound bright in the clear autumn air. "Indeed we have, Mr. Simmons." "And speaking of which," Caleb continued, dropping his voice conspiratorially, "Daniel looks about ready for his afternoon nap." Faith pretended to consider this. "And I suppose the mending I was planning to do could wait an hour or so." "Or two," Caleb suggested, pressing a kiss to the sensitive spot just below her ear that never failed to make her shiver. "Mr. Simmons," Faith admonished without heat, "are you attempting to seduce your wife in broad daylight?" "Attempting," Caleb raised an eyebrow. "I'd say succeeding, based on the look in your eyes." Faith couldn't deny it. The love between them had only deepened with time and shared experiences, the physical expression of that love as vital and necessary as the air they breathed. "Come on, little man," she said to Daniel, who was indeed beginning to rub his eyes sleepily. "Time for your nap, and then Mama and Papa have some discussing to do." Caleb's laugh followed them into the house, warm and full of promise like the future they were building together. Winter came early that year, blanketing the ranch in snow by early November. As the world outside grew cold and still, the Simmons household remained warm and lively, centered around Daniel's increasing mobility and the preparations for his first Christmas. Faith's prediction about Daniel needing a brother or sister close in age proved prescient when, just after Thanksgiving, she shared the happy news with Caleb that their family would be growing again by late summer. "Are you sure?" he asked, joy and concern mingling in his expression. "It's not too soon after Daniel. Dr. Mitchell says I'm healthy as can be," Faith assured him. "And many women have children close together. It's actually quite common." Caleb gathered her into a gentle embrace, one hand coming to rest protectively over her still flat stomach. "Another baby," he marveled. "Our baby." The emphasis on "our" wasn't lost on Faith. Though Caleb had never shown anything but complete devotion to Daniel, she understood that this child, conceived in love between husband and wife, held a special significance. "Boy or girl, what do you hope for?" she asked, curious. "Healthy," Caleb said immediately. "Beyond that, I don't much care, though a little girl with your golden hair and smile would be something to see." Faith kissed him softly. "We'll know in about 7 months. In the meantime, we have Daniel's first Christmas to prepare for." As December arrived, bringing with it the first anniversary of their meeting, Faith reflected on the extraordinary journey of the past year. From the desperate young woman banished from her father's house to the confident wife and mother she had become, the transformation seemed almost miraculous. Yet it hadn't been a miracle, she knew, but rather the steady accumulation of daily choices and actions. Caleb opening his door that cold night, Faith choosing to stay and build a new life. Both of them discovering, day by day, the love that had grown between them, nurturing it carefully like the precious gift it was. On Christmas Eve, with Daniel fast asleep in his cradle and a small tree decorated in the corner of the sitting room, Faith and Caleb sat by the fire, sharing a quiet moment amid the season's festivities. "I have something for you," Caleb said, reaching into his pocket. "An early Christmas gift." He handed her a small, wrapped package. Faith opened it carefully to reveal a delicate silver locket on a fine chain. "Oh, Caleb," she breathed, opening the locket to find a tiny photograph of Daniel on one side, the other side empty. "It's beautiful." "I thought we could add a picture of the new baby when it arrives," Caleb explained, helping her fasten the chain around her neck. "So you'll always have your children close to your heart." Faith touched the locket gently, overwhelmed by the thoughtfulness of the gift. "I love it." "And I love you so very much." "I have something for you too," she said, rising to retrieve a package from her sewing basket, "though it seems humble in comparison." Caleb unwrapped the gift to reveal a hand-knitted scarf in deep blue wool, clearly made with great care and attention to detail. "Faith, this is perfect. Did you make this yourself?" Faith nodded. "Maria's been teaching me to knit. It's my first completed project." "Then I'll treasure it all the more," Caleb declared, wrapping the scarf around his neck despite the warmth of the fire. "How do I look?" "Handsome as ever," Faith assured him, settling back against his chest as they watched the flames dance in the hearth. Outside, snow fell softly, covering the ranch in a pristine blanket of white. Inside, wrapped in each other's arms, Faith and Caleb Simmons contemplated the future they had built together, a future neither could have imagined when Faith first appeared on his doorstep, desperate and alone. "A year ago tonight I thought my life was over," Faith murmured, watching the fire's glow. "I had no idea it was just beginning." Caleb's arms tightened around her. "When I said my door was always open wide, I had no idea what would walk through it, or how completely it would change my world." "For the better, I hope," Faith teased gently. "Beyond anything I could have dreamed," Caleb assured her, turning her face up to his for a kiss that held all the promise of the years to come, years filled with children's laughter, the rhythm of ranch life, and the enduring love that had transformed two broken souls into a family stronger than either could have been alone. As the fire burned low and Christmas Eve turned to Christmas Day, Faith Harper Simmons drifted to sleep in her husband's arms, secure in the knowledge that she had found not just shelter, but a home, not just acceptance, but love, not just a second chance, but a life more beautiful than any she could have imagined in her darkest hour. And it had all begun with a door standing open, and a cowboy brave enough to welcome whatever fate might bring through it.